My placement this year was in the Hazlet Public School District at Wilkshire Early Childhood Center in a kindergarten classroom. Before taking my literacy methods course, I believed that literacy learning and teaching were really more intended for small group instruction. Now I believe that while small group instruction is very important to help individual students grow and become better readers, writers, and speakers, large group and whole class instruction can be just as helpful. My opinion on the whole class instruction has definitely changed this semester because in previous classes I had only ever worked with students in a one-to-one basis for literacy instruction. Additionally, I had never been able to track the growth of a whole class in a tangible way for literacy before. When the text-based lesson was first assigned, I was a little concerned as to how my students would react to reading one passage as a whole class. My concern originated in knowing that many of my students are on different reading levels, and some of them are below grade level. Also, at first glance of the polar bears passage, I noticed that there was some technical language and terminology that my students are not familiar with, and it is more difficult for some of my students to read expository text independently. However, of each of the 3 lessons that I taught, I found the text-based discussion lesson to be the most interesting, complex, dynamic, and the most beneficial to teach. I feel like this particular lesson was one that was very important to teach in kindergarten because students are just becoming familiar with using text as a tool, and this lesson allows them to explore what it means to be an interactive reader who looks for clues within the text. Because our class texts tell teachers that students learn best when students have a way to engage with the text, I had my students vote on the question from the passage. That question was, do you think polar bears should live in zoos? Why or why not? After voting and sharing prior knowledge about polar bears, I showed a video of a mother polar bear with 2 babies in the wild, and then I showed a video of a polar bear from the Detroit Zoo playing in its exhibit. Once my students were familiarized with polar bears, I turned to the text. In order to teach this lesson effectively, I made sure to define the bold words from the passage with my students. Another way that I engaged my students in the text was to have them actively looking for clues or evidence throughout the reading. I told them that once we had read the text as a class, they would have the opportunity to discuss what we had learned about, and I was going to ask them to vote on the question again using what they had learned from evidence in the text. While reading, I asked a few questions to make sure that students were staying engaged. Additionally, when the word Arctic came up in the text, I asked how that climate was different than the climate that we live in. Questions like these opened students' minds to the text and kept them on track for the post-reading discussion. Because the reading ended with the question that we used to vote, it opened the opportunity for students to vote again. Before they had the chance to vote, I asked my students to think about how their thinking changed and whether or not they still believed what they voted for initially. After voting, students could see the difference between the first and the second vote. I found it interesting that almost all of the students at the end of the second vote decided that polar bears should live in zoos. I then asked the question of how our thinking changed throughout the lesson. A lot of students then volunteered answers, which was really cool because they pointed to evidence from both the text and videos. If I did this lesson again, I would have students do the actual reading of the text, though I did not do that in this lesson because I was introducing the concept of a whole class discussion. Overall, this lesson was successful because my students learned how to engage text to support their opinion, which made them more conscious readers. Teaching this strand showed me that in the future I will be able to use text-based discussions in order to facilitate discussions between classmates on the text that they are reading and how they found evidence to support their ideas.